Hello, I'm Matthias Martins. Welcome back to my reading of my book, How to Do Things with Stories. We previously read the introductory chapter, and now it's time for Chapter 1. What can be done? In this book, we'll tend to ignore questions of what makes art good or bad, literary or pulp. Instead, we ask what makes it effective or ineffective. The word effective implies an action with intention. Consider the explosion of a vacuum cleaner bag. There may be many effects on the surrounding area, but that does not mean the explosion was effective. There are two conditions for a thing to be effective. A, someone must have created it or used it, and B, the results must line up with the goal they had in mind. Who is the someone for a book? All signs point to the writer. For our purposes, we will ignore the intentions of anyone else, the reader, the critic, society, me, and focus only on that of the writer in the process of conceiving, planning, writing, and editing her book. For the writer to aim to make her book effective, she must intend some kind of effect. Presumably, this effect should be on the mind of the reader. There is enough uncertainty without bringing in other people or other body parts. So that she can choose her goal wisely, she also should have a sense of scope, of the range of things that can actually be done to the reader's mind through the medium of a book. But before we examine what might lie in this range, let's take a closer look at the fundamentals of the book-reader interaction. We will zoom in on the elementary particles of a book, its words, and ask ourselves, how is it that words have any effect on us at all? All thinking is about connections, from one memory to another, from a face to a feeling, from a wise proverb to a moment when it was necessary to defy it. Thinking links our experiences to each other. It bundles them into ideas, bundles ideas into perspectives on the world. Just as importantly, thinking breaks connections. It undoes links through the passive process of forgetting and through the active process of rejecting what no longer holds or no longer serves us. If thinking truly is about making and breaking connections, then we can say the same thing about language, and hence about the process of reading. In language, there are two basic ways to make a connection. The first is like this. I point to a stream and say, water. By doing this, I help teach a connection between the word, water, and the sights and sounds of the thing it stands for. I make a bridge between the personal world of sensory experience and the common world of words. The second way to make connections is the one we use in literature. We string words together into sentences. We make bridges between concepts. Like this. Jane hopped onto the alligator's back. That sentence had, I hope, a noticeable effect on your mind as you heard it. Yet it was your imagination, not the words, that did the bulk of the work. You likely conjured up a rough idea of a person named Jane, made them perform the action hop onto, and as the target of that action brought in a concept of alligator, focusing on just one aspect, its back. By repeating this exercise often enough, the Jane-alligator connection could be strengthened in your mind. Every time you saw an alligator, you would think of that hopping Jane. And every time you met someone named Jane, you would immediately picture them making a solo attempt to start an alligator rodeo. This is how we make connections with language. We also discussed breaking connections. How can we do that? Earlier, we talked about how thinking can break connections by revealing that they are faulty. But that is not the only way, or even the best way, to break connections as a writer. If I tell you that in fact Janes are exceedingly unlikely to ride any alligators, I may convince your mind. But I won't undo the conditioning that made you associate Janes with alligators in the first place. In fact, I may even reinforce it, because it is still a conversation of alligators and Janes. One way to actively break a connection is to create a crop of rival connections that outcompete it. If you moved to a world where everyone named Jane was occupied as an ice cream truck driver, with no other interests or hobbies, all the other Janes in your mind, Jane the librarian, Jane the alligator rider, etc., etc., would fade out of recognition. Their connections would be pruned. This picture is accurate within reasonable limits, but we're still far shy of a real understanding of how language influences us. In practice, our test sentence will probably not be effective. It lacks context, so the association between Jane and alligators does not settle deeply into the reader's mind. Also, merely repeating an identical phrase is usually not enough to make it more memorable. We very quickly become numb to the news that Jane has hopped onto an alligator's back. For a better example, we need to understand how excitement and inhibition affect the connection-making process, which means we have to add emotion to the mix. Roughly speaking, humans are driven by core desires that come from a fairly small set. We want to stay away from sickness and danger. We want to seek out what keeps us well and allows us to grow. And we want to pass something of ourselves on into the future, whether through creation or procreation. These drives have a physical life in the brain. The home of these core drives is the most central part of the brain stem. Without it, we aren't. The brain stem may think, but its thoughts are ineffable. It has no use for language or even for words. Its concerns are just those three drives: appetite, fear, sex. If we have words for these concerns, it's only because there's a lot more to us than the brainstem. When we compare our own brains to those of other animals, we see how much humans have specialized in overclocking that soft, mashable, sugar-hungry little organ. Our brains consist of complex, overlapping, interconnected structures. The connections of those structures form a tangled web that fans up and outward from the brain stem like the branches of a tree, widening, splitting up into segments, wrapping around one another, but always rooted in the stem, that is, the trunk. Over the course of our evolutionary history, the brain structures tended to build up in layers. Inner structures, closer to the brain stem, were more likely to stay the same over generations. Meanwhile, younger, more outward layers formed to serve new purposes. They had more freedom to change through evolution because they were less foundational. Ultimately, these more outward layers gave us humans the ability to form complex plans that could succeed in a wider range of circumstances. Seafood, eat it, became seafood, save it, eat it, became seafood, plant it, harvest it, save it, eat it, and so on. What this toy model gives us is a way to think about emotions. Emotions seem to live in the in-between layers of our brains, not the specialized outside, or the stem that powers our primal drives. They mediate between the two layers, translating from one way of understanding into another. In this way, emotions adapt our primal drives to new scenarios that arise as our worldviews become more complex. A little primal death fear resides at the heart of one's disgust at unwashed hands. A little primal hunger at the root of one's curiosity. Through words, we address our emotions, and through emotions, we understand the functioning of our primal drives, which are always concerned with the continuation of life. As writers, we transmit words to our eventual readers. What we do not do is choose how our readers will understand those words. Our phrases activate ideas and trigger flashes of association. Our goal, as writers, is to write in a way that resonates deeply, that triggers recognition at an emotional and even primal level. Taken individually, each word in a story has the power to alter the associations in a reader's mind. Taken as a whole, these effects build up into chain reactions. Hundreds of shifts occur as a result of each sentence, thousands more playing out over time as the cascade of each passage runs into the cascade of the next. Ripples of association and emotional resonance reverberate through the brain, illuminating everything from the rational circuitry of the neocortex to the naked impulses of the brainstem, and effecting transformation. It is a transformation slightly determined in its broad features by the vision of the author, but in its details it is unpredictable to both reader and writer. This, in broad outline, is how words on a page alter the mind. When they affect us deeply, they trigger emotions that excite us to our core. This has an important consequence. Everything in the brain connects back to our core, so things that shift our core have the potential to also shift things everywhere else in the brain. In other words, the deeper the resonance of your writing, the less predictable its effect on your readers. This does not mean that a writer who seeks to master the art must give up on understanding the impact that her words will have. Amidst the chaos of mental transformation that occurs during reading, there are islands of predictability. To find them, one must form an idea of the reader. If there's one piece of writing advice we all know, it's this: know your audience. But there's more to it than that. In order to sharpen the intentionality of your writing, I say that you must ask yourself two questions. 1. Who is your audience? 2. What do you want to do to them? Write with an individual person in mind. They can be imagined or otherwise, but the more detail, the better. Make believe that you perceive their innermost self, their likes, their dislikes, their loves, their hates, their highest hopes, their darkest fears. Finally, with that understanding in mind, imagine an effect. Change an opinion. Cleanse a confusion. Infuse a dream with the courage to realize it. This will form the basis for the direction of your story. The writer may blanch at the idea of aiming for a specific effect on the reader. It might sound manipulative, even arrogant. On the contrary, humility is a fundamental requirement of effective writing. The writer must always be aware of the chaos of effect, and how a real reader's experience will veer away from the writer's intention. Nevertheless, if the writer dislikes intended effects even as an ideal, there is another way to frame the work we will do in the coming chapters. Writing is a lot like teaching. Where teaching is the giving of knowledge, writing is the giving of experience. By offering her experience, a writer enriches the reader's life. She offers a new perspective, a new way of thinking, a new way of being. There is a close relationship between writing and one kind of teaching, what is known as the Socratic method. Through the Socratic method, the student is invited through questioning to uncover the things that they already know. Similarly, writing invites readers to question their beliefs, often without their even realizing it. Through this questioning, readers begin to educate themselves. This is the alchemy we will explore in the coming chapters, and its inner workings are the same, whether one's aim is to influence or to share. With all this in mind, let's return to our test sentence and see if we can deepen its resonance. Jane had been walking for hours. It was strange that a town once so familiar could change so little and yet be entirely alien to her. This was the site of her new beginning, but it was full of ghosts. Muddy cleats scuffed the sidewalk that ran parallel to the mottled grass of a silent public park. Halfway along the edge of that park, Jane turned her head to look across the blank expanse. By chance, a row of maples led her eye to a playground on the opposite end. A flash of reminiscence tugged her toward it. That bright red slide, where her mother had caught her. Those dark blue swings, where her mother had pushed her. Her mother was nowhere now. The pieces of her that remained had sunk into the abysses of memory, and every replacement the foster care system could provide had joined her there, not as deep, but just as lost. The city held promise of a fresh start. It was flush with traffic jams and help-wanted signs. Jane was here by choice, needing nothing to complete her. Still, she wondered what could have led her in all this concrete sprawl to one little playground that sighed to her of lost times. Jane had crossed the threshold onto the sand. In front of her was a turquoise alligator, resting on a tightly coiled spring. There was something about this playground toy that seized her attention. What was it? Had she ridden it? Had she been warned away from it? Had it been good? Evil? She looked around to assure herself that the park was still empty. Then, with a sense both playful and piercing of broken taboo, Jane hopped onto the alligator's back. I've been Matthias Martins. Thank you so much for listening to Chapter 1 of How to Do Things with Stories. Stay tuned for Chapter 2, Ambiguity.